My name is Chris Goldhorn, and this is Balancing Individual Rights with Collective Security. Benjamin Franklin was once quoted as stating, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Obviously, we as Americans hold our individual rights and liberty near and dear to our hearts. In many ways, our high value of individual liberty serves as the bedrock of our country's foundation and the premise of the Constitution. Even though our Constitution grants powers of the federal government, it also establishes individual rights that limit the government's authority to pursue those powers. One would argue that, given our nation's heritage and the architecture of our Constitution, individual rights would trump any attempt of government infringement. However, with the constant evolving technological world and the ever-present terrorist threats around the world, we must consider if honoring our individual rights are worth our safety and security at times. In turn, it seems appropriate to consider how applicable Benjamin Franklin's quote would be in today's world. Nevertheless, the topic is very controversial and covers areas such as free speech, national security and terrorism, right to privacy, and gun ownership. I'll explore the balance between individual rights and collective security, and while doing this, compare and contrast the different positions between the two ends of the spectrum, and where we should be as a society. As important as individual rights are, there may be some instances where the security of the collective may have to trump some individual rights. It's very difficult at times to determine to what degree this balancing should take place. There seems to be little doubt that there is a trade-off when considering balancing liberty and security. We must be very careful how much we allow the pendulum to swing in either direction, and if we go too far in the collective security and sacrifice too many individual rights, we may end up with a dictatorship. If we go too far in the other direction and value our individual rights too much and sacrifice too much collective security, we would be in a society where we living in constant fear of terrorist threats. On one end of the spectrum, we have the utilitarianism view. The goal of the utilitarian view is that the greatest good for the greatest number. Believes that the benefits of the collective outweigh the rights of liberties of individuals. A utilitarian government would operate in a manner in which it's the greatest good for the greatest number, and it judges the rightness and wrongness of actions by the goodness and badness of the consequences to the collective. Furthermore, a utilitarian judge would not need to consider what was fair or just, but what had the greatest usefulness for the greatest number of people. Now, given incidents like September 11th, 2001 with the terrorist attacks, we had almost 3,000 people killed on U.S. soil and countless more injured or affected. There continues to be constant terrorist threats around the world, and to a lesser degree, it led to more screening processes and things like that. But to a more drastic measure, it led to the issuance of the USA Patriot Act by Congress, which led to wiretapping and more power to law enforcement and the government to detain suspected illegal aliens. Now, given that the act was passed just months after 9/11, it wasn't as highly debated as it probably would be today. 16 years removed from it. Just in 2015, the San Bernardino attacks occurred. In 2012, there was a Sandy Hook elementary school incident where we lost 28 people, the majority of them being elementary school age children. It sparked a wide debate regarding gun ownership and led to heightened screening processes and gun restrictions. Now, the list of incidents goes on, and a utilitarian view would agree that government restrictions are appropriate in responses to these types of incidents. Among these would be sacrificing search and seizure rights, due process rights, Fifth Amendment rights for the collective security, it being reasonable. One would argue that it's outrageous for somebody's neighbor to have an arsenal of weapons for no apparent reason, especially after something like the Sandy Hook incident. The utilitarian view would be that surely it's in the best interest of our society to sacrifice some rights, and sacrificing a few fundamental rights for the greater good is not only reasonable but necessary. A utilitarian would argue that sacrificing something as important as national security by clinging on to every possible liberty is a profound mistake. It would lead to anarchy in our society, and we would be living in such fear that we couldn't even enjoy our civil liberties and rights. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is individual rights, far outweighing any government interest that may arise. Sacrificing these individual rights would be an erosion of the Constitution and our liberty. Individual rights serve as an independent checks on government power, not capable of being even put into balance, in which they are outweighed. They can be outweighed. Now, according to this perspective, we as citizens should not be persuaded by fear of terrorist attacks and crime to give up our civil liberties. Our civil liberties should not be collateral damage in the fight against terrorism. We should have our system of checks and balances will erode with our civil liberties if we give them up. There are risks that come with living in a free society. We take a chance that civil order will maintain with our current appropriate system of justice. For example, you don't see terrorist attacks happening in North Korea. However, North Korea is not a free society, and their country is run by a dictator. And furthermore, their country terrorizes its own citizens. That's what you get when you don't have any civil liberties. Now, these perspectives present a very important positions on both sides and should both be considered. On one hand, you must have some degree of collective security. There cannot be a free and prosperous society without some degree of security. Without collective security, crime would run rampant, and we would live in constant fear of terrorist threats. However, we cannot establish adequate collective security without sacrificing some civil liberties and rights. This is controversial because it's difficult to determine how much we sacrifice and how much is too much. We must maintain our fundamental rights in order to maintain our democracy on the other end. It appears obvious that we must have a balanced system that establishes a sufficient collective security without sacrificing too many fundamental rights and civil liberties. We must have a social contract with our government and fellow citizens, a contract in which we obey the laws of our society in return for good government. This is difficult at times because after recent terrorist attacks, it could sway, public agenda in one direction or the other. However, we must not be swayed by fear and sacrifice our rights for a little bit more security, because without our individual rights, we're no longer a free and prosperous nation. We must also not be so narrow-minded as to not maintain our collective security. There must be a system of checks and balances that ensure that the pendulum doesn't swing too far in either direction. We must allow our government to maintain our public, our legislators to pass laws, our courts to make decisions, and our law enforcement agencies to enforce the laws. However, we as citizens must maintain our checks and balances of our society by voting. We must continue to vote for our public officials that represent our collective views and our needs. We must also be cognizant of the proposed laws and how they affect our individual rights. At times when it is necessary to do so, we may have to sacrifice some of our rights in order to ensure more national security. In these cases, judges may have to make necessary decisions based on what's going on in our country at the time. However, when we are in times of peace and our threat level is lowered, we shouldn't have to sacrifice so many civil liberties. In conclusion, we must be a nation of healthy balance in order to maintain our prosperity.